Stanley is fascinating. He's like the Beatles. I mean, the thing that sort of blows your mind about the Beatles, because they are so prominent and predominant in pop culture, you're certain going into it that the Beatles started sometime around 1950 and ended sometimes around 1985, right? The truth is that the Beatles were around for precisely one decade, from 1960 to 1970. That was it. Everything that changed everything forever happened in the course of 9.5 years. It's the same with Stanley, and it's about the same time, right? Stanley was active between more or less 1961 and like 1971. Had this great success, came to it again as a middle-aged man after 3 decades of working in the comic book industry and finding a lot of heartbreak for a host of reasons. The comic book industry, for various reasons, some of them economic, some of them political, was kind of decimated throughout the 50s. It was the subject of a congressional hearing that started at the exact same day of the McCarthy Army hearings. It was led by a German or Austrian emigre psychiatrist who said that comic books were really bad for the kids. His proof was that he interviewed some juvenile delinquents at a juvenile delinquent facility, and virtually 100% of them read comic books. Of course, 100% of them also wore shoes, which hardly made shoes the cause of their juvenile delinquency, but the sort of idea of correlation not equaling causation didn't really appeal to him. So that there was a lot of censorship and a lot of kind of social pressure against comic books, and Stanley was ready to quit this. Luckily, his wife, who was very wise, convinced him to give it one more shot. The shot turned into the Fantastic Four, then led into a cascade of creativity. But then in the 1970s, he was, I don't want to say a victim of his own success, but several things happened to him. The first is that the corporate suits sort of appointed him ambassador at large, which meant that his job was to wear a cool toupee and a nice sweater and go around the college campuses and talk to the kids and be cool, which is virtually what he spent the last 50 years or 45 years of his life doing. And the second thing that happened is that comic books really were or the golden age of Marvel comic books were a really distinct product of the 1960s, because once racial tension simmered out of control, once the war simmered out of control, once reality hit this boiling point that just made it almost impossible to ignore, comic books as an escapist fantasy really had a very hard time. And this is something that Stanley dealt with his entire career. Some of his readers, a lot of them, in fact, insisted that it was time for Spider-Man to make a stand about Vietnam. And he kind of dabbled in it, but that, I think, the weight of this brought him down. And at some point, he figured out it was a much better gig. Just go around and be Mr. Marvel, smiling Stan, and enjoy what ultimately was his greatest creation, which is Stan Lee.
So you mentioned the youths of back then. I want to talk about the youths of today. I mean, you describe this. A lot of people describe their own origin stories as finding comic books, no matter what your childhood is like. And as someone pointed out in the Q&A, you can have a ton of friends and still like comic books. I mean, people really find that. I guess I'm curious. We had this whole fight on today's podcast about music and whether music means the same thing today to kids as it does as it did to kids growing up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when like cassettes, when things just it was not as easy to get music, and music wasn't everywhere and with you in your pocket or your earbuds always. I'm curious how that functions for comic books. I mean, it seems like they're probably easier than ever to get. I mean, there's really nothing niche about comic books anymore, right? They're the big blockbusters in all the cinemas. So do you think this plays the same role? And do you think that there is that same pressure today to have Superman respond to Vietnam? Like, is that a pressure that publishers are facing?
So before I answer,
not Vietnam anymore.
Right. Thankfully. Before I answer, I urge everyone looking to observe my white beard. The fact that I'm a middle-aged white man, all these, I suspect, have a very large part to do with what I'm about to say. But what I'm about to say as I shake my fist on my porch and urge the young ones to go away, is that I think kids today really have missed a fundamental and necessary moment in time, and it's exactly what you said. I think it's the scarcity that made these things so special for us. I mean, on today's podcast of Unorthodox, we talked to the writer Nick Hornby, who told us, and I very much feel the same way, that when he was young, you had enough money to buy one record a month. So whatever you bought, that's the album you're listening to for a month, because you have 15 of them. Growing up, I mean, yes, I got my start with a big kind of chunk of comics that I bought on this one trip, but those were all the comic books that I had for about 3 years. So every single one of these comic books, and some of them are really minor and stupid, like Archie digests that I picked up. Every single
I
one
liked
of
Archie. I read those in camp.
Those are great, but every single one of those to me were scripture, right? I delved into them with this like Talmudic passion, because that's all I had. And as a result, a lot of my identity became predicated on, well, what kind of comic book nerd are you? Are you the comic book nerd who reads like manga? Or are you the comic book nerd who reads like this version of superhero? Or like, are you a Dark Horse comic book guy or a Marvel comic book guy? Which is exactly like saying, are you a heavy metal kid or are you an emo kid? The entire identity was predicated on this. I see kids today, and kids today, they can get whatever they want. There are comic book subscription services out there that literally give you access to every single comic book, or 90% of comic books ever created at a click of a button. And this abundance makes them so much smarter than I think we were, and so much more sophisticated than we were. But at the same time, I look at it and I see, like, while it's so slick and so great and so cool feeling, something's missing there. Something so elemental. I'll just make a bunch of more enemies for no reason and say the sonic equivalent.
The comments is telling you to get off their lawn.
I know.
Or is quoting you as saying, "Get off my lawn."
So the sonic equivalent of that to me is someone like Billie Eilish, right? It sounds so amazing. It is so beautifully produced, and it's such a great song. But then you look at it and you say, like, that sounds to me a lot like the work of a really cool, really smart kid who just hasn't lived. Like, there's something about the analog world that forces you to live, if only to fight to get this comic book that you love, if only to get the second album from this artist that you discovered completely by accident because you stood in the physical freaking store and were going like this through shelves and saw a cool cover and be like, who's this guy? I want to read or listen all about what he did. All that is gone. All that is never coming back. Our youth was better. And thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Okay. I can't believe you're going after Billie Eilish. That was like real shots fired at 7:35 on a Thursday. We thought we were like, having a nice quiet evening.
This is what Sauvignon Blanc does to me.
But I will say that Rachel makes a really good point in the Q&A, which the physical copies are hard to get, but digitally it's easier than ever. So I have to imagine, just in the way that there are like eBay scourers, people who look for the original first print, like how physical items have become so much more rare and therefore valuable, that having the first edition or having the first issue of this one comic of, even we wrote about comic books in the newest Jewish Encyclopedia, which was our book that came out in the fall from the host of Unorthodox. And even just licensing images, we had a whole entry on comic books, right? Like, licensing images is really, really hard. I mean, there's a scarcity that actually that creates a market for it, right?
I will take a why my book has no art in it for 500, Alex. Look, that's completely right to me, but that is also part of sort of what went wrong, because Stanley, again, victim of his successes, is not too far-fetched, because here we are, and it's like the late 70s and the early 80s, and all these nerdy boys who grew up reading Marvel are now nerdy middle-aged men who have disposable income. And the comic book publishers sort of understand that, and they understand that they need to play it up. So they start doing things like, well, we're going to launch a brand new series because the first issue is the most valuable one. So all of a sudden you have 17 series coming out. And then they do something that's even more kind of maddening. They say, we're going to launch this very special issue, and there'll be 4 different cover arts to it. And you have to buy 4 versions of the same comic book just to have the different art. And at some point, it becomes this kind of speculative, commercial, just ruined game, because the thing that I think gave it so much of the thrust, and the thing that made these nerdy college kids in the 60s feel like Stan Lee was really a person who listened to them and heard them and understood their kind of emotional inner lives, was the fact that these were disposable, that these were fast and cheap in the best sense of the word, that these were here in a flurry. They were part of a torrent of content that is here today and gone tomorrow, not something to collect and put in like between a nice little cover sheet and then sell for $100,000 a copy.
So we have a question coming in that's actually not a question. It's more like a comment, but actually a directive, which says, just more about Stan Lee and Judaism, please. So let's get back to Stan Lee and Judaism. What were his parents like? What was the Brooklyn that he was raised in? I mean, what tell us about the community? I mean, we also had a question come in that said, why did he go off the derech? Which we usually associate that phrase with leaving the ultra-Orthodox community. I mean, was his secular life, was it problematic for his family?
So I would start by saying this: the Brooklyn he grew up in was Manhattan. He grew up two streets or 2 blocks from where I'm sitting right now. His father was an immigrant from Romania.
By the way, I just assumed he was from Brooklyn because that's like that generation of successful people are all from. He went to Erasmus High School with Barbara Streisand
and Woody Allen,
Einstein.
Correct. And Alan Dershowitz, and they created Howard the Duck together, which would be a great comic book I would pay to read. So his father was a Romanian immigrant who worked very, very hard and had some success in the schmata business, and married later in life and had Stan, and they grew up here on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in relative comfort, and everything was okay. And then, alas, they had another baby, but then the Great Depression came. And his father, Jack, had this idea that I think was a sound idea, that people would still need to eat even through the Depression. And so he literally took the entirety of the family's fortune and bought a diner. And that crashed and burned. The investment was not good. The diner did not make it through the year. And Jack was just broke. He was unemployed. He spent his entire day running around outside because they didn't have a telephone and no other ways to seek employment. So he would spend his entire day sort of like shuffling about trying to find some employment, and then coming home sort of beat and broken, and fight with his wife and sort of just have this miserable existence. And Stan's mean of escaping, which of course he put in far cheerier terms because he's this kind of all-American sunshine boy, but we're reading books and going to the movies whenever he could. And one thing that I think he got from this period was this idea that work was paramount, that production mattered a lot, which also
content,
not just content, but like putting it out in a way that was sort of flowing and immediate. I believe, and this is a theory, that this is one thing that gave birth to the now famous Marvel method, which is basically really interesting, because if you look at the way every other comic book was made at the time, there were different artists for sort of every different department of making the comic book, and they each worked pretty much in seclusion. Stanley had this great big insight in which he would sit an artist down and he would tell a story, which is just a very brief synopsis. And then the artist would go and draw whatever the artist wanted to draw, loosely based on what Stanley said. And then Stanley would write the actual text. And that provided a great big breakthrough, because all of a sudden, you could have real artistic collaborations. And I want to say something in a minute about his main collaborator, Jack Kirby. But it also allowed for a tremendous torrent of comic books just being created, which I think is the kind of legacy of someone who grew up and saw his family crushed by the Depression. In terms of synagogue attendance, there was some. Again, by his own account, he only went to shul because there was a girl he liked. Another account says that he was in a drama club of his local synagogue. I don't think that he necessarily went off the derech. I don't think necessarily anyone was particularly observant in his world, and he himself sort of had some choice words to say about organized religion throughout his life. But I think this growing in the precipice of disaster, seeing life really frayed, and finding solace in storytelling, shaped his life and fed into what I agree with what you said before, Stephanie, was probably a great sort of already laid in Jewish sensibility.
So Neil is asking if we could circle back to the question of why so many Jews were involved in the comic book industry. And Lois points out a little bit earlier that Superman and Batman, DC Comics, those were all created by Jews. So your whole thing about like the Christian iconography, she's pointing out that actually those were Jews too.
Oh, no, but to me, that's actually seminal to me. Those were, Siegel and Schuster and Bob Kane, creators of Superman and Batman, respectively, were very much Jews, but I think they were trying to kind of goy-splain America, right? They were trying to kind of put on a cultural product that they thought would appeal to the universe at large. I think one of the things that set Stanley apart is that he was far more willing and far more comfortable to indulge in something that was so off kilter, right? That was so far from what the mainstream was at the time, and of course was so Jewish. And one of the great lessons that I think we could learn from here, and this is of course my interpretations, the whole book is a work of literary criticism and interpretation. But what I think we could learn from here is that there is nothing is more universal than the specific. I think if you try to write a kind of great big universal cosmopolitan fable, you come up with something that feels, bland, like Superman. If you say, no, I'm actually going to write something that's incredibly Jewish and it's very rooted in my experience and I don't care, it's just what I am and I'm very proud of it, you end up creating a product that the entire world loves because the same sensibilities resonate through the cultures. It's like how Fiddler on the Roof,
I was
right?
just about to say that.
This sort of big, because we're on Zoom call number 17 together today. Became this big hit in Japan because the Japanese said, "Oh, it's about family. It's a show about our culture." But meanwhile, yes, but it's also about the shtetl.
No, and it's funny, Edgar Carrot also said a very similar thing, which was that like his stories, which are deeply, they're written in Hebrew, primarily, they get translated into English and other languages, that he finds their universal appeal to not be surprising at all, because sort of the more specific you go, the more universal it actually is. I mean, I think that's really, really interesting and sort of a neat way to view American Jewishness, right? Like this idea that actually the guy who was I know DC Comics was successful too, but like Stanley actually, by turning on the Jewishness, was able to do something that his fellow Jewish counterparts couldn't do because they were sort of trying to appeal to a different audience. But this brings me to a good question that comes in, which is, are there any superheroes that are Jewish in the canon, like that whose characters are Jewish?
I'm gonna go ahead and say every single freaking one of them is. But specifically, yes. Here's what we know. First of all, we know that the Thing is Ben Grimm is very much a Jew. There is a
The Thing.
The Thing.
The Thing. Okay, just translating for people who don't know.
People who don't know, Google it. A big orange, rocky, monstery thing from the Fantastic Four, of course. So his real name is Ben Grimm, and there are always these sorts of kind of, is he or isn't he, in the, I believe, 90s, but I can't be wrong. There was a fantastic comic book whose name was Remembrance of Thing Past, which is just a great title. And any comic book title that throws in a Proust reference has already won me over, in which Ben Grimm returns to the old neighborhood because he is racked by guilt. He had stolen a high pendant, or a Star of David pendant, from a pawnbroker, and he arrives, and the pawnbroker is attacked by some bad guy, and the Thing saves him. And then they have this entire great conversation about teshuvah, about being Jewish, about being proudly Jewish in the world, and it ends with a pawnbroker giving him the pendant. That's one. Another one that's, of course, very famous, and again, this is Stan Lee's genius and the little clues that he put into the characters, inspiring later artists. Um, the great saga of the X-Men. In the original X-Men, the origins of Magneto, who is the main, I don't want to call him a villain because often he's sort of at the very least, an anti-hero. He says really cryptic things like, "Remember, I saved you that time in Europe when the trouble happened," which, of course, every Jew would 100% immediately say, "Oh, of course, Holocaust." But later, again in the 90s, subsequent Marvel writers really kind of dove into Magneto and Professor X, his sort of counterpart frenemy story, and wrote this incredible book in which their origin stories, that they meet at a hospital in Haifa, Israel, that treats Holocaust survivors who suffer from PTSD. And then Magneto reveals that his true background was that he was sent to Auschwitz and forced to work in the Sonderkommando, which, you know, those who've watched, what was the name of the movie,
Son of Saul.
Son of Soul, know how awful that was. So a very kind of specific Holocaust survivory story, and that again to me is proof that so much of the DNA that Stan Lee had implanted in these characters inspired later generations of comic book creators, some of whom weren't even Jewish, to really sort of dig the story and the essence and develop these characters into what they truly are.
There's actually an incredible question here from David Bader, who says, did their Jewish ancestors have anything like cartoons? I mean, is there a historical predecessor of the comic book? Were there like caveman drawings of Batman? Were there like shuttle papers going out, Bintel briefs about them?
You know, that is an incredible story. The visual format and the mass producedness of things obviously presented its own difficulties. But to me, whenever I read these comic books, the first thing that comes to my mind is Hasidic tales, right? It's these great big stories in which there are miracle workers, there are kings and princes, there are sometimes demons and dibbuks and all kinds of, you know, mazikim come in and out of the story. To me, that form of loose, fantastic, literally and figuratively speaking, storytelling it feels very, very, very Jewish. It's not a folk tale. It doesn't have the kind of heavy, you know, Teutonic moralizing effect. It's more nimble, and it depends on these characters which back then were the Hasidic masters and right now are the superheroes, to really sustain.
So when are we going to see a Hasidic superhero?
Inshallah, as they say in Yiddish, b'mehera b'yameinu. I think anyone, Rachel Pinellas, who's been asking great questions here and is a fantastic comic book artist in her own right, maybe she should pick up the gauntlet. But anyone who wants to sort of make amends for the sins of Unorthodox, not the great podcast, but the terrible Netflix show, should give the world its first.
So like you're spitting some hot takes tonight.
Oh yes, I am.
What is the name of the Thing comic with the Jewish content?
Remembrance of Thing Past. I want to take a moment and say something that I can't believe it took me 51 minutes to say, but we spent this entire time talking about. 51
minutes. Only one person left this Zoom talk, and it was my mom. And she stayed for like 45 of them. So wow, this is.
We'll talk in the morning. The thing I want to say is that we spent a lot of time talking about Stan Lee, and Stan Lee deserves all the credit for the great work that he did. But Stan Lee was only one half of Marvel. The other half was his artistic collaborator, Jack Kirby, who, as I'm spitting hot takes here, I'm going to go ahead and say, to my mind, maybe the greatest American artist of the 20th century. A fantastic, towering talent, a Goya of comic books. If you don't like comic books, just for the Kirby crackle, you know, that kind of really nervous energy, black with blue and yellow and pink sort of mini explosions on the page. These things convey so much emotion in such a tight space, and the pages are organized so beautifully. That man is almost never celebrated for his contributions, and really should be. He's an absolute genius.
So Liel, I feel enlightened. I think the most interesting thing about reading your book, which I did in anticipation of when we talked about it on the show, and I really loved it, and I don't know anything about comic books, and so I think what you did really, really well, and I'm saying this here on the record, this is being recorded, everyone's going to know I believe it. Did a really good job of not just humanizing sort of a larger than life character in a larger than life universe of his own creation, but you also brought home the spiritual aspects in a way that was really fascinating. It actually makes me want to read. Oh, someone just said they just bought your book. So yeah, those sales are just taking up. I think what's really, really interesting is the way you make these connections to the spiritual world, which is actually probably, I think a lot of Jewish people who are interested in comics might never have thought that that's why they might be interested in them. But these elements, excuse me, really, I feel like add a new dimension.
You know, we think that we're done with the past, but the past is not done with us. The old traditions and the old ideas keep wrestling with us, even if we think we're long done wrestling with them. Which is why I think Stanley and his work are so fascinating, because they create this sort of bridge. They create this kind of neutralized, secularized, colorful arena in which we could continue to ask the same questions that have obsessed us since the dawn of time, but since we lost the language to ask them in kind of, Talmudic, yeshivish, religious ways, we continue to ask the very same questions, the questions of what it means, as Lou Schubert is asking now very poignantly on the Q&A thread, what it means to be strangers in a strange land. The question of what does it mean to have power and then responsibility. The question of what does it mean to be in communion with another, group of people, family who you love so deeply and yet can't stand. These are the questions that any religion, rises to try and address. And Stan Lee gave us a continuation of religious mythological thinking by other means, and an opportunity to think about it in a very Jewish way, which is not just kind of dependence on higher beings and their grace, but that is actually a world of deeply flawed creatures that is obsessed with small details and ideas and practices and rites, and invites us all to fail again, and fail better.
I love that. And the good news is that everyone here who has not yet read this book can get a discount. Go to jewishlives.org, use the code Stanley, one word, all caps, STANLEE, not his given name. He was Stanley Lieber. We know that now. But you can get that on jewishlives.org. You can get a 25% discount. Liel, great to Zoom with you. Thanks for doing this. And I want to thank the Yale University Press Jewish Live series, the American Jewish Historical Society, and the Center for Jewish History. Of course, this event is part of the Tablet Live web series. You can check out bit.ly/tabletlive for a bunch of fun upcoming events. This Sunday, I will be cooking with Einat Admoni, the wonderful, the falafel queen. She runs the Taim Falafel Empire. She has some great cookbooks. Balabusta, the most recent one is Shook. We'll be cooking a recipe at 2 p.m. from her new cookbook Shook, and should be fun. So bit.ly/tabletlive. Liel, a pleasure.
All mine.
On this great book. Sorry for interrupting all the time.
I think I'm used to it by now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Good night.